We see it across industries. A highly charismatic, magnetic leader who generates massive results while simultaneously crushing the people working closest to them. Boards and followers often look the other way. Because the numbers are high, they excuse the destructive behavior as intense passion, grand vision, or the heavy burden of leadership. This pattern mirrors the ancient archetype of the unfaithful shepherd, the leader who, instead of feeding and protecting the flock, begins to feed on them. If you are caught in the blast radius, the gaslighting takes a toll. You start to second-guess your own reality, wondering if you simply lack the grit for a high-performance environment, or if you are being subjected to genuine abuse. Let's clear up the ambiguity. Toxic leadership is an existential threat to the organization, even when it is disguised as high performance. To cut through the subjective excuses and psychological manipulation, we must evaluate this behavior through an objective filter: hard biology. Behind the spiritual language or the corporate buzzwords, toxic leadership represents a hardwired reality in the human brain. The damage inflicted on followers goes beyond temporary emotion. It involves measurable physical alterations to the brain's structure. Organizations face a stark mathematical trade-off. They can secure short-term institutional peace by ignoring the behavior, but the price is long-term neurological scarring and eventual systemic decay. An organization can cultivate a healthy culture, or it can harbor a toxic rainmaker. Neuroscience proves it cannot have both. Inside the leader's brain, a reliance on intimidation represents a reinforced neural tachle rather than a simple lapse in judgment. Over time, toxic behaviors form rigid basal ganglia loops. Tearing others down becomes a subconscious reflex, firing faster than deliberate choice. When challenged, the amygdala, the fear center, spikes, hijacking the prefrontal cortex and shutting down the capacity for empathy and rational thought. This research details exactly how the ventromedial prefrontal cortex and the amygdala interact. They are the physical battleground for emotional regulation and cognitive control. Because of this hardwiring, toxic leaders often lack the capacity to process criticism. Their brain treats professional disagreement as an existential threat to their survival. A toxic leader operates on a circuit wired to prioritize personal defense above the health of the team. Now look at the direct report or congregant. Constant unpredictability and unjust accusations force their brain into a chronic state of high alert. Operating in an environment devoid of psychological safety triggers a biological consequence known as toxic stress. Toxic stress floods the body with cortisol. This constant chemical barrage damages the hippocampus, eroding the brain centers required for learning and memory. This chemical flood forces the victim's brain into a permanent fight-or-flight survival mode. The ability to think creatively, execute complex tasks, or trust colleagues is dismantled. Medical literature draws a direct line between this environmental emotional dysregulation and the aberrant neural circuitry found in severe anxiety disorders and PTSD. Keeping a toxic leader destroys the cognitive initiative of the team. Burnout is a biological injury, observed through the breakdown of the brain's regulatory systems. This brings us to the governance boards and middle managers, those who witness the abuse but actively choose to keep the peace. They rationalize their silence, believing they are protecting the institution's public image, its mission, or its bottom line. The toxic leader interprets that silence as an absolute endorsement. Without friction, their harmful neural pathways solidify, emboldening them to escalate. The institutional decay follows a predictable path. The healthiest, most competent people recognize the systemic failure and leave, resulting in a steady exodus of talent. This inaction is a failure of nerve. It is a systemic leadership collapse that infects the entire organizational structure from the top down. When a board avoids a messy confrontation today, they trade long-term stability for an immediate, fragile peace that hollows out the institution from within. If you are facing this reality, you need a precise intervention protocol. The decision tree splits into two paths based on your institutional authority. If you sit on the board or hold positional power, you must establish strict behavioral boundaries, set clear metrics, and initiate immediate intervention. Do not fall for the illusion of a quick fix. Rewiring a toxic leader's neural habits requires profound repentance and unyielding structural accountability. If the leader will not submit to that level of accountability, they must be removed. Decisively addressing the toxic leader is the only way to restore your organization's biological and institutional immune system. But what if you are the target, an employee or congregant who lacks the positional power to change the leadership? First, acknowledge that your burnout is a biological reality, distinct from your spiritual worth or professional skill. If a compromised board continues to protect the leader, fighting from the bottom is a biologically unsustainable battle. If the system refuses to hold the abuser accountable, you must execute your final strategic move. Remove yourself from the toxic stress environment.